Bit of an interloper here, so I appreciate just to be asked to be among this auspicious crowd, and delighted to connect to Rachel again, who I just found out was my daughter's small group Sunday school leader years ago when we were here at St. Andrews. So that's really lovely. So I come from the world of education, and so we'll be bringing some of my insights to bear, hopefully, on what our topic for this conference. So let me begin my presentation with a couple of paragraphs articulating some questions relevant to my concerns for this session. Here's the questions. Is it going to be possible to save men from becoming officials and functionaries and workers to the exclusion of all else? Can that possibly be done, and if so, in what circumstances? The man who is fettered to the process of work may be ultimately due to the inner impoverishment of the individual, whose life is completely filled by his work. Because his life has shrunk inwardly and contracted, with the result that he can no longer act significantly outside his work and perhaps can no longer even conceive of such a thing. Of course, specialized and professional work is normal, the normal way in which men play their part in the world. Work is the normal, the working day is the ordinary day, but the question is whether the world defined as the world of work is exhaustively defined. Can man develop to the full as a functionary and a worker and nothing else? Can a full human existence be contained within an exclusively workaday existence? Now, my sense is that these questions resonate with anyone who's ever woke to find themselves trapped in a system or an institution that, intentional or not, overwhelmed them with work and overwhelmed their ability to think of themselves, even for a time, as much more than a functionary in a totalitarian regime that determined when she ate and slept, what she thought and did, and was often populated with too few citizens to move the piles of dirt from here to there. It's less waking up in Dante's dark wood of error than waking up in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. If you know this movie, it's a movie he interestingly made after talking with Mahatma Gandhi about the dehumanizing impact of modern machine technology and bureaucratic efficiency. But though these two paragraphs weren't written by a surgical resident or rotating doctor, their sentiments have probably been felt by more than a few, and I would guess more than a few in this room. Instead, these questions come from a lecture given by Joseph Pieper a few years after Charlie Chaplin's movie, when Pieper was alarmed by the post-war efforts to rebuild Germany's economy through normalizing what he describes as a system of total work. The tyranny of the economic urgent was pressing German laborers and professionals to adopt worker as their primary identity and to order their intellectual, moral, cultural, spiritual, physical, and social interests accordingly. And by order, it meant at least bifurcate those interests into a strictly separate sphere called life. This is one of the tributaries that gave us this ubiquitous category error called work-life, and the incoherent phrase work-life balance. Incoherent not because no one can achieve it, but because it claims that work is not a constitutive element of life, but an equal and opposite counterpart to life, with its own ontological order and deontological claims. And in professions like healthcare and education, work can move from being an equal partner to a kind of tyrannical Cronus, regularly invading the work-life border and devouring time on the other side of what I think is an incoherent divide. So thus, Pieper worries that in a total work culture or institution, even time supposedly devoted to life becomes time simply off the clock, given precisely for us to rest and recover so that we can go back on the clock a better worker. Thus, one's professional identity begins to commandeer, consume, or at least marginalize one's personal identity, other vocations, and areas of human formation that are constitutive of holistic human well-being. See, Pieper's concerns seem especially relevant to me when I've heard Ryan quote Dan Ariely's description of contemporary healthcare and modern commercialized medicine as a fixing people production line dominated by production line logic. It's precisely what Charlie Chaplin's, his concern 100 years ago, when in my mind, like a Shakespearean fool, he gets us laughing at him only for us to realize that we're actually the fools at whom he is laughing. See, whether you're a patient or physician, you probably know what industrial healthcare feels like and looks like. According to a lot of the testimony we've been hearing and research that I've seen and that people have shared, it looks like decreased job satisfaction, inefficient care, burnout, high rates of depression, fractured homes, poor physical health, lack of sleep, poor patient care, career changes, and what really matters, not inconsiderable cost to the healthcare industry when it loses professionals in whom it has invested not insignificant time and money. Now, we probably actually shouldn't be surprised that this collapse of what might otherwise be a multidimensional thick self into a monodimensional thin self of the worker, healthcare or otherwise, leads to this often unconscious rebellion of the self that we call burnout. Ennui, or in the medieval term first used by Evagrius of Pontus, then Cassian, Aquinas, Pieper, and Kierkegaard, among others, acedia or acedia. This is Kierkegaard's despairing sickness unto death, if you know that work. The temptation to quit working for the good, a kind of restless sadness, listless resignation, and lethargic abandonment of the pursuit of moral and spiritual goods. In Kierkegaard's understanding, it results when the self refuses to be the self it has been created to be, or succumbs to the pressure to be as something other than it is. In our case, reducing the self to healthcare worker instead of a holistic human person. Burnout, exhaustion are the self's natural reaction to institutional and cultural pressures to reduce one's fulsome self to the thin self of the functional worker. See, in doing so, we rely on the thin self for personal fulfillment because we have almost no other self, and we act in Augustine's terms as if we're trying to enjoy the self who's a worker rather than use it. So introduce a professional setback, failure, slight, or imposed moral compromise, and the thin self lacks the thick reinforcement to endure the blows. So the thin self understandably responds by removing itself from the corrosive context or finding alternative coping mechanisms, self-medicating with some palliative combination of sex, substance abuse, or material consumption. One of my close friends is a psychologist who works in a hospital, and the two clients he works with primarily are healthcare workers and returning veterans, and it's really fascinating for him to describe the similarity in the symptoms and coping mechanism between those two groups. So the expectation to become a thin self and to hive off or bifurcate one's life and multiple vocations from one's work and identify as worker is really only rarely made explicit within the curriculum of healthcare training programs and clinical work. But it's frequently embedded in what we've already referred to and heard as the hidden curriculum. To find the hidden curriculum, you don't ask professors or senior practitioners, you ask students. You ask those who are in the system, and you ask them these kinds of questions. Who gets praised here and for what? Who's esteemed as a model? What's permitted but really looked down upon? What are the accepted vices of this place? What do people brag about knowing they will receive praise? What are people here allowed to complain about? What are people allowed to spend time on and what not? See, the hidden curriculum matters because training programs, clinics, and hospitals, they function like moral microcultures that are, in Christian Smith's words, thickly webbed with moral assumptions, beliefs, commitments, and obligations. These get built into the structured social practices and relationships within which people's lives are embedded, and they come to inform the worker's assumptions, expectations, beliefs, aspirations, thoughts, and judgments and feelings about themselves and their work and life. It's similar in my mind to Charles Taylor's phrase, the social imaginary, or Peter Berger's plausibility structure, which determines how we interpret what is and what should be. Dallas mentioned some of this yesterday. Institutions inevitably shape people, especially when those people are there to learn and during some of the most formative years of their life. How it shapes people and whether it shapes them well is a secondary question to the mere fact that it does shape people. So, given the alarming studies on the well-being of healthcare workers that we've seen over the last 15 years, We're obviously here asking how healthcare schools, clinics, and professionals might help healthcare workers develop and maintain what I'm calling the thick multidimensional self that regards work as one constitutive element of a well-lived ordinary life, but not the only element. We're asking whether and how thick communities of moral formation might develop in order to form thick personal selves. And we should be asking, and I'm interested to hear how senior healthcare professionals can begin incrementally transforming their potentially corrosive practices and institutions. Because those students, residents, and interns come and go, the culture of a place is really perpetuated by those who remain, which is most often professors and senior practitioners. Some here, senior practitioners, may have been able to develop a thick self with well-ordered loves, but many will not. In addition, this responsibility of senior healthcare workers to have to have the imagination for strategically pursuing long-term institutional change is especially heavy on some of you in influential institutions. I study the history of education. In the history of education, if something was happening at Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, or Princeton one year, it was happening in Yorkshire and Midwestern grammar schools within 10. And though cultural and institutional change is slow, it does happen, especially if it's pursued by dense networks of people with strategic imaginations. So I'm not immediately, as I've said, involved in healthcare profession myself, though I come from a family of nurses, including my mom, my aunt, and my sister-in-law. So I've endured many conversations about bodily fluids at dinner and full of tragic and shocking stories from the ER, most especially when I made the mistake of mentioning to my mom and aunt one time over dinner that I was thinking of buying a motorcycle. Yeah, exactly. 30 minutes of tragic ER stories later, I was like, yeah, I'm not buying a motorcycle. So I never did. It said, I'm a What's that?
Donors.
Yeah, donors, I know, exactly. I heard that and all the horrible stories that I still can't get out of my imagination. So it said, I'm a theologian and ethicist, and much of my research focuses on the history of human formation in liberal education from classical times through the Christian medieval Renaissance and early modern periods. And I work with lots of teachers and schools. Teachers, you might be interested to know, are the other profession experiencing levels of departure similar to healthcare after COVID. So across this broad and varied sweep of educators, schools, and practices, long tradition of liberal arts education has maintained that the ends of education should be aligned with, conducive to, or at least not corrosive of, integrated multidimensional human well-being or flourishing. So the early Athenians spoke of forming the person who was kalokagathia, good and beautiful, in this fulsome way. Aristotle of the person who was tekalon, beautiful. Hugh of St. Victor refers to moving students from esse to pulchrum esse, from being to beautiful being. You get the concept of paideia for eudaimonia, formation for flourishing. And of course, the Renaissance humanists just think of in the terms of humanitas. Now, I'll just point out that you'll see beauty through several of those, and the classical definition of beauty was a harmony of well-developed parts. So to create the beautiful person was to create a person with a harmony of well-developed parts. Now, the long tradition of liberal arts education includes what it called common or mechanical arts, among which it included medicine. From that long tradition, I think we can distill 7 consistently recurring areas of human formation that nurture holistic human formation. That is, which form these thick selves that flourish in themselves and are more capable of sustaining the self through difficulty. Long tradition of Christian liberal arts pursued these 7, again, believing that to reduce the scope of human education was to reduce the scope of human being. So let me unpack these 7 areas of human formation and flourishing. No single educator describes it quite like I do, so I'm the only one to blame for it. But my taxonomy I'm going to introduce here certainly been informed by educators across the tradition like Augustine, Boethius, Erugena, Hugh of St. Victor, Aquinas, Melanchthon, Newman, and Anna Cooper especially. So I've structured the chart to show how each general area of education or formation, the key questions each area helps us ask and answer, as well as the ends, the methods of achieving the end, deficiencies it overcomes, and the consequences of focusing on any one area alone, which results in a different version of the thin self. So let me start with the one that encompasses the medical profession, which is the practical formation. This includes professional specialized training, but also the common or mechanical arts that meet human needs, including agriculture, architecture, weaving, cooking, theater, business, and medicine. You see here the domain is the practical formation. The question it helps us answer is, what kind of work should we do? What kind of work should I do? Tradition has consistently said that which is truly beneficial for other people. How? Through developing the skills to do that work. What's it help me overcome? Something like uselessness or having nothing to contribute to the common good. But if we focus on that element alone, it ends up producing the pragmatist or the pragmatic person who sees education simply as job training. Now, this area of practical formation in the common arts was sometimes criticized in the Greek tradition. We have the phrase the servile arts, which really just means the serving arts, but we think of it as they did, sometimes as a lowly pursuit. But in the Christian tradition, that gets entirely reversed because you get folks like Erugena and Hugh, Bonaventure, Luther, and Melanchthon, who see these arts as pursuing real needs and helping ameliorate the physical effects of the fall, participating in God's resistance movement against the effects of sin. So, as a brief example, both Martin Luther's son and Philip Melanchthon's son-in-law were physicians. And under Melanchthon's influence, the University of Wittenberg becomes the leading school in Europe for medicine and medical practice in the 16th century. 1542, Melanchthon, a professor of Greek theology and ethics, and Luther's more ironic right-hand man, if you know him, praises the salutary nature of the physician's art and argues that all people, all students should have some knowledge of the elements, of the temperaments, of the function and the nature of the limbs and organs in human, of the causes of diseases. By 1545, Melanchthon gets it so that every single Wittenberg University student has to have training in anatomical and medical studies. He extols the countless benefits of the art of medicine, lauds it as the gift of God, praises God as the maker of remedies, and quotes Sirach 38:1, this Reformation theologian, "Honor the physician, for God has created him for the sake of our need." So medicine that treats the damaged body and counseling that tends the damaged soul are both placed among the common arts here. But let's move back up and let me expand this to show where this area of formation fits into the whole. So first area of formation often addressed is intellectual formation, helping us answer the question, what should we know? Tradition generally has said, well, we ought to know the true. How do we do that? Through nurturing and practicing wonder and the intellectual virtues. Helps us overcome ignorance or error or muddle or confusion. But again, if we just treat intellectual formation and knowledge as the only good, we are in danger of cultivating the vice that the tradition called curiositas. This was the vice that acts as if knowledge alone is the sole good. It's the vice, obviously, that killed the cat, screwed up the Little Mermaid, cost Goethe Faust his soul. The magician's nephew Icarus died because of curiositas, and of course Adam and Eve in part ate the tree because it looked good for knowledge. It drives the gossip. It drives anybody pursuing knowledge through any kind of means, including torture, etc. But intellectual formation helping us answer the question, what should we know? Moral formation helping us answer the question, what should we do? But also in Augustinian terms, what should we love? And the tradition said, well, that which is truly good. How do we do that? Through cultivating prudence and the moral virtues, helping us overcome vice. But again, the thin self, who acts as if the moral good is the only good, is in danger of becoming the moralist. Or pursuing simply moralism. And we probably know people who fall into one of these two categories already. Third, the tradition has said, okay, what about aesthetic formation as a human person? We respond to beauty. So it helps us answer the question, what should we create, but also what should we enjoy? So the tradition has said something like we should know the true, do the good, and make the beautiful or enjoy the beautiful. How? Through developing skills and a certain taste, helping us overcome kind of material, visual disorder and ugliness. But again, the thin self who only pursues this one is in danger of just pursuing aestheticism, thinking that only beauty matters, not truth and goodness. Fourth one, spiritual formation, certainly in the Christian liberal arts tradition, but really even in the Platonic and Aristotelian version of the liberal arts, helping us answer the question, who or what should we worship? So the holy, how? Through piety, which helps us overcome here a kind of spiritual acedia or spiritual numbness or listlessness. Again, danger here of myopically focusing on this is pietism. Now, I'll stop with these before I go to the final three, which are kind of subsets of the good, but you'll notice the true, good, beautiful, and holy here sometimes described as transcendental. The transcendentals are transcendental properties of being, meaning they are characteristics of more than just one thing. They transcend it, and they can be found in all manner of things across creation. Believing in Romans 1, that God himself is true, good, beautiful, and holy, and elements of God's character can be found throughout his creation, so that whenever we find these, we are attracted to them because we were, in Augustine's terms, our hearts are restless because we were made to rest in God. And so the true, good, beautiful, and holy, wherever we find it, are like conduits that are supposed to lead us to God. So just pointing that out before we move on to the final three. Physical formation. How should we use our bodies? Believing that we are our bodies, as Brian was helping us think through last night, not we inhabit our bodies. So how should we use our bodies? By pursuing the healthy through discipline to help us overcome malady. And again, the myopic obsession ends up in what I'm calling narcissism. Here, finally, we're back to the practical. What should we do? And then finally, the social. How should we relate to others? The tradition has said through the neighborly. How do we do that? Through cultivating habits of service, and we might think of as the civic virtues to help us overcome individualism, but a myopic focus here ends up in a kind of tribalism. So this is the 7 ends, if you will, of education from the long tradition of the Christian liberal arts. So they can function both as guiding principles for a school. How are we helping students pursue these across these various categories? But also for our life. How am I pursuing these 7 areas? And in our context, do I model the pursuit of these for others? And do I create conditions for others to pursue them? So given this summary, I wasn't surprised at all when I went looking for them to discover scholarly articles reporting what the tradition could have told us, that participating in the creation and enjoyment of visual and performing arts improved healthcare workers' emotional well-being, that physical activity bolsters healthcare workers' sense of satisfaction, that participation in religious or social communities gave healthcare workers a stronger sense of purpose, that intellectual pursuits outside of medicine were found to be refreshing, and that regular play decreases rates of burnout. I found scholarly articles on each one of these, which are good, though I'm cautious, like Pieper, about programs that only introduce these other goods simply to make a better worker, simply to help the person be a better worker for that, what I'm calling the thin self, because these are good for human persons as persons, not simply qua worker. So I would say that to develop the well-ordered professional identity requires the well-ordered personal identity, or the thick multidimensional self. So we might ask, and I think we are asking, how are we going to introduce and reinforce, or can we even, this holistic vision of into the training of the healthcare professional? That is how the language and vision might be worked into the common vocabulary and practices of our thickly webbed moral microcultures and social imaginaries. And how senior healthcare professionals might model their own pursuit of integrated multidimensional formation and flourishing and create space for others to do the same. See, senior practitioners help create the cultures in which practitioners are formed, and who else is there to explain, correct, and model what it means to be a person who is a doctor, surgeon, or nurse, a person who practices the medical arts? Students and interns learn their skills in part by imitation and guiding practice. The tradition just called this mimesis. It's what teachers do. I do, we do, you do. And it always included learning much more than simply the skill, but also a certain way of being in that particular role. So we've talked a little bit in the last couple of days about what this could look like with para-school programs like several people here have ran or are running, and like the one Ryan's getting ready to do down at Duke. And to Dallas's point earlier, I think if the institution or these thick communities is morally well ordered, it certainly will apprentice healthcare workers in prudent moral reasoning. My hope, it will help them become thick selves, possibly whose moral consciences can better resist institutional moral disorder, because it's the conscience of an integrated self, not merely the conscience of a worker. It may still experience a kind of moral harm, but it may be able to maintain its own moral integrity. So my community that I'm a part of, this honors college, is a dense community. But let me unpack just one class that I teach there that tries to help my students develop this thick self oriented towards a well-lived ordinary life. And in my class, we ask this simple question: what is a well-lived ordinary life, and how can it be pursued through any vocation? Now, it's a seminar that I lead for last semester graduating students, but it bookends a course I taught them as first semester freshmen called The Good Life, which really attends to big questions of virtue, love, suffering, and self-knowledge. Now, if I could only offer one class in a program, I would probably offer some combination of my Good Life class with my Ordinary Life class. So the Ordinary Life is a class I teach, again, to these students, not many of whom are going into the healthcare, but some are. Of my 30 graduating students this year, I have 6 going into healthcare, 4 to medical school and 2 into nursing contexts, and 2 are coming here to Oxford to pursue DPhils in Armenian and Middle Eastern studies this coming fall. But my students are therapists, teachers, chemists, cybersecurity experts, musicians, and soldiers, and I'm trying to give them a vision for what it looks like to live a well-lived ordinary life regardless of what they do, helping them to get a vision for how they might resist the pressures of their particular institutions. And with students entering the military, cybersecurity, and finance, this is a real concern for many of them to be shoved into alternative ontologies with their own deontologies. So briefly, the course begins with some version of what I just gave you, considering with my students what human goods are, what multidimensional flourishing looks like in a well-lived ordinary life, and we read some of the folks on the board. And then we just move through kind of stages of their life. We talk about the ends of education with the great black classicists Scarborough and Anna Julia Cooper. Then we move towards after education work, thinking about leisure and work and total work with Joseph Pieper. Moving from there to think about the working life and vocation with John Paul II and Dorothy Sayers. As you work, you make money, so we talk about pursuing money or thinking about money as an instrumental good with John Wesley's great sermon number 50. About having a home with that money, and we think about having a sacramental home with Thomas Howard. Filling that home with art and beauty. Inviting friends to that home. Playing with those friends in that home with some of these authors here. Pairing off with one of those friends. We think about romance, sex, and marriage. With Bonhoeffer, we think about community and church. Finally, we start thinking about the Ars Moriendi and what it means to live well and die well with Ecclesiastes. Concluding with a couple stories, J.R.R. Tolkien's wonderful Leaf by Niggle, where we start thinking about not only an ordinary life, but an ordinary eternal life. If you know this wonderful story, we do it as a reader's theater. And then finishing with Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter, which is just the story about one well-lived ordinary life that picks up all the other themes. And throughout the whole thing, we're learning Mary Oliver's wonderful poem Messenger, which is about work. So it's a bit like taking my students, or it's a bit like sending my students on a vacation to a foreign place I can't accompany them to, but at least before they go, when they get there, it won't be the first time they thought about these things. And they will have had 14 weeks with me thinking about what a well-lived ordinary life looks like. So this approach, in conclusion, it goes beyond considering virtues and interventions tailored simply to the healthcare worker, cybersecurity expert, soldier, teacher, academic, or whatever their vocation might be. I mean, were I teaching the course just to healthcare workers, I might tailor the readings, but I might not. I might just do these and let the conversations drift where they will. See, this more comprehensive approach that I'm trying to pursue argues that these areas and ends are goods to pursue qua persons, not merely qua worker, but again, to flourish as a worker requires them to pursue goods across these various domains. So, in conclusion, nearly everything, to bring us back to Pieper, nearly everything that Pieper wrote in the 40s and 50s had this same end in mind, pointing people to the intellectual contemplation, moral prudence, exposure to beauty, worship, and celebratory gratitude they need to live well in the modern world. He's a representative of the long tradition of Christian liberal arts education, and he affirmed that the practice and pursuit of these goods better enables professionals and persons to resist the conditions of corrosion that produce the thin self in Charlie Chaplin's modern times. The goods and practices Pieper lauds function as a kind of paideia for eudaimonia That is, for the being of the integrated, multidimensional, beautiful being of the thick self who uses their medical arts to participate, knowingly or not, in God's work to meet the real needs of suffering people. And as we discern how to do this in the current conditions of modern healthcare, that vision and gatherings like this, to me, seem rather hopeful, even if we can't pull it all off by the end of our rotation next Tuesday evening. Thank you.